Que lo que es, mi gente? Bendiciones. Dios te bendiga. This is your brother David Rodriguez with another episode of Hispaniola History Channel. And this one is titled Protector of the Indians. Who were the protector of the Indians? And how does it play a vital role in the history of Hispaniola and the Americas as a whole? Who were the protector of the Indians? Who was the first Dominican to advocate for the rights of Native Americans? What were the laws that protected certain Indians? Who were the Indians protected by? And what was Mexico's role in the illegal slave trade of Native Americans? We all know the propaganda and the Black legend images that we get bombarded with in terms of how the Spanish Empire dealt with the native inhabitants of America. Much of it, of course, was overblown and exaggerated. We know that there was a spiritual and legal approach to how the Spanish dealt with the Indians, notwithstanding how the ordinary Spanish soldier might have dealt with the Indians. We're talking about what the Spanish crown through the courts and what were the initial intentions of the Spanish crown in dealing with the native inhabitants of America. So just a basic Google search before we go into other sources. How did Spain treat Native Americans? The Spanish attitude towards the Indians was that they saw themselves as the guardians of Indians' basic rights. So they saw themselves as the guardians. And laws of Spain controlled the conduct of soldiers during wars, even when the tribes were hostile. What was Queen Isabella's stance on Native Americans? According to NewYorkHistory.org, it says here Isabella acknowledged that the Spanish settlers have been kidnapping and sexually abusing Native American women, as well as stealing from Native communities. She instructs the governor to make sure everything stolen from Native people is returned and set severe new punishments for this crime. So this has to be severely noted because this is the intentions of what the Queen of Spain wanted for the Native people of America. Columbus and his regime violated every law and requirements made by Queen Isabella. This is well documented. He was arrested for his crimes. We all know this. The admiral and explorer was not loyal to Spanish interests. Instead, was more concerned with securing land and wealth for him, his family, and his network of investors, including merchants from Italy and England. England begins to explore the Americas 100 years after Columbus, but takes a very different approach, interacting with the natives. What was the major difference between Spain and England when dealing and interacting with Indians? Here's an article, Gale Encyclopedia of U.S. Economic History, The Treatment of Native Americans, Spain versus England. It says here that Christopher Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola in 1492. He met natives there. When this was reported to Queen Isabella of Spain, she immediately decreed that the natives were her subjects and were morally equal to all her other subjects, including the Spaniards themselves. They were to be treated humanely and not to be enslaved. They were to be treated humanely and not to be enslaved and to be Christianized. This was Queen Isabella's intentions. And of course, Columbus went against that. When Queen Isabella died, most historians focus on Bartholomew de las Casas as being the protector of the Indians. Is this accurate credit to give a man who didn't become an active Dominican monk until 40 years after Queen Isabella's death? Why do historians continue to give Las Casas all the credit and as being the one who protected the Indians? Las Casas originally participated in the conquest of Hispaniola and later became a priest, first with the Franciscans and later joining the Dominican order. He is the most well-known protector of the Indians, but was he the first? According to Introduction, a short account of destruction of the Indies by Bartholomew de las Casas, and Louis Hank, Free Speech in 16th Century Spanish America, it says here, Antonio de Montecinos was a Spanish Dominican friar who was a missionary on the island of Hispaniola. And with the backing of Pedro de Cordoba and his Dominican community at Santo Domingo, Montecinos was the first to publicly denounce the enslavement and harsh treatment of indigenous peoples on the island. He initiated an enduring struggle to reform the Spanish conduct towards all indigenous people in the New World. Montecinos' outspoken criticism influenced Bartholomew de las Casas. Let me read that again. Montecinos' outspoken criticism influenced Bartholomew de las Casas. So it was Montecinos' work that influenced Las Casas. In 1511, Dominican friar Antonio de Montecinos from Hispaniola begins his civil rights movement for Native Americans. Audiencia de Santo Domingo, the court system, was established around the same time on the island. So it was the courts, the legal system, that was the driving force towards this civil rights movement for the Native Americans. Also, that same year was the first recorded carnival, a celebration that took place involving Christians and Moors, natives and Spaniards. This is well documented. So who were the protector of the Indians? Protector of the Indians was an administrative office of the Spanish colonies that deemed themselves responsible for attending the well-being of native populations by providing detailed witness accounts of mistreatment in an attempt to relay their struggles and a voice speaking on their behalf in courts, reporting back to the King of Spain. So there was a system in place to protect the Indians, and they were to report back to Spain. And remember, we covered this in previous episodes, 1526, the foundation, when we covered the Indians that were returned to Florida by the Dominican friars from Hispaniola. First so-called black slaves in North America are using the date of 1526, but it was these very same black slaves were actually Native Americans being returned to the location from where they were originally taken from. So the liberation of the Florida Indians were ordered by the Dominican friars of Hispaniola. Dominican monks were an extension of the Spanish court system, which advocated for the rights of the Native Americans. In essence, the first civil rights movement in the Americas was the protector of the Indians. This protection will come as a set of laws and ordinances. Reading from a source here, a source that I used before in prior episodes, Surviving the Spanish Conquest by Karen F. Anderson Cordova. And from pages 170 through 185, they are a set of laws, a list of laws and ordinances from the Spanish crown in dealing with the Indian slave trade of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. So from 1495 to 1501, Indians were taken as slaves by Columbus. It was ordered by the Spanish authority to be returned, for the Indians to be returned. Even in 1501, when the governor Nicholas Ovando was taking some of these natives from surrounding islands, he was ordered to return the natives back to the islands. In 1510, natives of Jamaica, Cuba, and San Juan, Puerto Rico, were protected and were at war with the Lucayans. Here goes 1510. The admiral and royal officials of Hispaniola dictates that persons from Hispaniola cannot have Indians in San Juan, and no Indians should be brought from Trinidad or from Jamaica or Cuba. And then Indians can be taken from northern islands, the Lucayas. 1511, Caribs attack San Juan, the island of San Juan, and take Indians. So here in 1511, we have accounts of Caribs attacking the island of San Juan and taking Indians as captives. There is given an order that the vecinos are thus allowed to go to these areas and retrieve the Indians to take them back. So there was an order from the Spanish crown to go into these islands and take back the Indians that were originally kidnapped by Caribs. So there was a tug of war here between the Caribs and the Spanish in terms of the Caribs kidnapping Indians and Tainos and the Spanish retrieving these natives. An important note here, it says whom they can have as laborias. The text of the document says laborias rather than slaves. So these are not slaves, these are laborers, wage earners, people who are working for a wage. And to make a distinction between slave and laboria, laborer, we're going into the Oxford Language Dictionary. Laborias, personal service of a servant. Laboria is a servant. Laboria means worker class, wage laborer. Laborias became, in effect, the first wage laborers of the hemisphere. It says here. So those Tainos, those Caribs, and all those people being imported into the island, so these are the servants who were being shipped into Hispaniola. These who they really were, laborers. Laborias were America's first employee, in essence. And of course, an employee is a person employed for wages or salary, especially at non-executive level. So these are your entry-level employees. 1520, islands protected by the Spanish crown. Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, of course, Hispaniola. These were the protected class by the Spanish, and they were considered Christians. Remember, even when Columbus first entered the island, he described certain natives as being Christian-like, indios, in God, God's people, right? So this is how we have to look at it in terms of the Spanish coming in and seeing equality within certain natives in which they wanted to protect from the Caribs who were going into these islands and kidnapping the native populations. So we have the accounts of the Spanish protecting the Indians from the Caribs. So 1525 to 1526, Dominican friar Antonio de Montecinos declares freedom for the natives of San Juan, Cuba, and Hispaniola. Antonio de Montecinos, 1526, December 1st, concerning the liberty of the Indians, again, declares that the Indians that are free or become free of encomiendas are to be granted their freedom. 1526, illegal slave raids in Honduras. Indians shipped to Hispaniola, prohibits sending Indians to Spain. So while there is a movement to end slavery in the Caribbean by the Dominican friars, there is an illegal slavery going on in the mainland, in places like Mexico. 1529 to 1530, 10,000 Indians from Mexico are shipped to the islands, and the Spanish queen outlaws the enslavement of the Indians. Ordinance of 1529, August 27th, in Mexico, we say an estimated 9,000 to 10,000 Indian slaves from Panuco and New Spain had been shipped to the islands. So when we hear about illegal slavery that was not supposed to happen, we usually attribute that to Africans, West African slavery, because there is not an account of how many came into Hispaniola. But here we have clear accounts of the native inhabitants of Mexico being shipped to Hispaniola illegally at a time where the Dominican friars were trying to ban the practice. So 1533, we find Yucatan Indians in Cuba. Here's an ordinance, January 13, 1533, talks about how 60 Yucatan Panuco Indians were found in Cuba. It says here in September 13, 1533, the Audiencia of Santo Domingo concerning the war against the Caribs, the war in the Caribbean against Caribs. Meanwhile, there are illegal slavery going on in Mexico, shipping the native Mexicans into the islands. 1534, Hispaniola files a lawsuit to prevent the selling of Indians in Mexico. So now, an ordinance from Santiago, Cuba, talks about how slaves were brought from New Spain to be sold, and how Indians arrived every day from the conquest of Montejo, the Yucatan, deposited during the lawsuit, a lawsuit in preventing this going on. 1540 to 1543, Santo Domingo pushes to ban licenses to take Indian slaves on the islands and the mainland. So there's an ongoing struggle to ban the slavery. Meanwhile, the natives and the encomenderos, the soldiers, the conquistadors, are going against some of these laws and ordinances and are sending them to the Caribbean. It says Audiencia of Santo Domingo indicates that they should stop the practice of giving out licenses to take Indian slaves from the mainland coast to residents of Santo Domingo and other areas. So there's a push to ban this. 1547, despite the orders from the king, American Indians were still being sold in Seville, Spain, 54 years after Columbus' first arrival in Hispaniola. So to summarize, from the very beginning, Columbus' arrival, Indian slavery was not encouraged by the Spanish crown, with many being returned from Spain. So also, when we hear about so-called slaves coming from Spain into the Caribbean, into Hispaniola, a lot of these people being labeled either Ladino or Bozales, we also have to take into account that some of these might be returning Native Americans as ordered by the crown. Natives of Hispaniola, Cuba, San Juan, and Jamaica were protected by the Spanish against the Caribs. Indians from the Christian islands were wage laborers, not slaves. So once you arrive in these protected islands, San Juan, Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, you're being received a wage for your labor and you're being protected by the Spanish crown. Although Indians had certain rights and protections in the Spanish islands, Mexico was becoming a center for illegal slavery. So while the movement was going on in Hispaniola to end the slavery of Native Americans, Mexico was doing its own thing and conducting illegal slavery. Much of these quote-unquote slaves and captives being shipped to Hispaniola and Santo Domingo. And the movement to free the Native Americans came mainly from Dominican friars of Hispaniola. This was covered. Antonio de Montecinos, a Dominican friar from Hispaniola. Antonio Montecinos deserves a credit as one who started that movement first, years before Las Casas. So as we can see that it was the Dominican friars as well as the officials of Santo Domingo that led the charge to end slavery for the Indians, as well as protect them from the warring Caribs and cruel slave owners. With Spanish nobles being faced with harsh penalties and litigation preventing the illegal enslavement of Indians, how did the practice of slavery continue? Who was keeping the institution of slavery alive in the new Spanish colonies of America? Who benefited the most in the slavery of Native Americans? Who were some of these caciques? Who were some of these Indian slave masters who were providing the Spanish with illegal slaves, operating on their own against what the Spanish interests were? Much of this blame is put on the Spanish, but as we can see, the Spanish laws were forbidding the illegal slavery of Native Americans. So who were these Native elites who were perpetuating the slavery of Native Americans? This is the Hispaniola History Channel with your brother David Rodriguez. Good night and God bless.